Bob Leder a welcome, please.
Thank you.
Hi, Bob. Hot seat for you.
Lovely, you too.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to know where to begin with you, isn't it? But let's begin at the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn.
Yes, I was born in Brooklyn, and it was a magic place. You only have to look at Google. Hundreds of celebrities and artists and wonderful, wonderful people were born in Brooklyn. Everything from the mafia, Al Capone was born there, Mike Tyson in the fight game, Barbra Streisand, the singer, Woody Allen. Goes on indefinitely. Sports figures. And it was an exciting place to have lived in the early years of my life.
I've always kind of got the impression that it's kind of a rough, tough place, and you've got to be a bit
God no,
strong
God no,
to
not at all. It's really interesting. There are literally, as I say, 26 ethnic communities. There was less racism there than there is today in the world. We all got along, we all fought our battles on the playing field, baseball and basketball and so forth. It wasn't rough at all, and although there were poor sections, of course, and there were poor people, there was no sense of anything but respectability about the borough. They had this. We all lived in our own divisions: the Scandinavians, the British, the Italians, the Irish, the black population. We all grew up together, and I sense that I noted that racism came in after the wonderful 30s and after the war. Much of it cultivated by politicians rather than by human beings, which is why, by the way, Andrew, I don't like politicians very much.
Then you went into the army.
Well, I didn't go to the army. I went to the Navy, actually. I enlisted when I was 17, the day I could get in. And it was the American Coast Guard, which is part of the American Navy during the war. It's an armed, unlike the Coast Guard here, it's an armed military wing. And we had the only vessels on the North Sea. And in 1940, when I went in, we were actually convoying British merchant ships before the war. We declared ourselves into the war. There was an agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill, and our Coast Guard crews, not the Navy, were patrolling and convoying British merchant ships. And I was in the Coast Guard. I was strangely enough, a chemical warfare officer. That in itself is a story, because I was the only man gassed in World War II, rather. I had a leaky gas mask and took a dose of what they call chlorine gas. But I had all these crews coming in from the North Sea. It was a terrible, terrible campaign. Bitter cold weather, German submarines, and so forth. And they used to come back in for training from persons like myself. I taught them how to defend themselves in terms of chemical warfare. And but I took this dose of gas, which they released me a year later. I was released with a major disability as a result of the chemical warfare poisoning, which permitted me to go back to school. I went to university, where it was a turning point in my life, because where I had planned to be an engineer, my hopes were to be a civil engineer. Matter of fact, I went to a high school, which was a preparatory school for MIT. But when I went to university, there were so the good athletes were all in the service, so I was pressed into action, and I became a so-called athlete, basketball, American football, and track and field in university. And I played. I was really talk Billis about being lucky. I mean, I was just lucky, because if the good athletes had been around, I don't think I would have survived. But I played in front of 30,000 people at Madison Square Garden. I ran against the Olympians and the Penn relays. I played American football and I play American football on the college level, which is very, very big in the States. And so my plans for engineering were deterred as a result of the athletic career. I spent 12 years in training, 12 months of the year. I hate the look of a gym or a treadmill today as a result of it, believe it or not. But from there, I had to find a job, of course, and I walked the streets of New York and walked into an advertising agency and said to the gentleman that owned it, I said, I'd like to come to work for you, and I'll work for nothing, just to learn the game. So he hired me, and I worked for him. In a space of about 6 months, I acquired some accounts of my own, and that was the beginning of my career. In the advertising and communications business. I then left the agency and went to work for a radio station. I didn't know. I would have spoken to Bill years ago about his background, which I really didn't know till tonight. But I went to work for a radio station, a new one that was being built in Newark, New Jersey. And I went to Columbia University to study radio and television. Television was in its infancy, as Bill knows, in those days. This was 1948, 47, 48. Programming was totally in its infancy. And I went to Columbia University, where the NBC management they were the teachers, they were the tutors. And they seemed to like me and offered me a job at NBC, which at that time was the major network in America.
Which is the national
broadcasting
system, like our BBC.
Like the BBC, but commercial, of course. And in those days, we were selling. I went to work as a salesman, selling both radio and television time, and which was fascinating. Because I progressed up the ladder in sales. Which is one of the quickest ways to achieve management status. If you have a record, it's provable. It's something to be provable. I went up and became sales director of NBC, and the years were miracle years because everything was in its infancy. All the shows were live. They were new. Woody Allen worked there. Mel Brooks worked there. Toscanini was our conductor. And I palled around with all these people. We were all part of the same crew, and we played poker at night, and we never went to bed. And every show was live then. As Bill knows, there was no tape. Well, nothing was taped in those days. Tape virtually didn't exist till the latter part of the 50s. But so everything was live, and so everything was exciting because it was totally spontaneous. The Show of Shows with Sid Caesar, the Milton Berle show. People would pay $100 to see a rehearsal because of the profanity from Martha Ray and people such as that in the rehearsals, which they couldn't get away with on the air at night, of course. So and I come up in the elevator in Radio City, 30 Rockefeller Plaza my office was 30 Rockefeller Plaza. I'd come up in the elevator in the morning with Toscanini, one of the great names in music in the world, and he'd say, "Hi, hello, Bob," and I wound up as a guest at his home and a friend of Toscanini. It was a remarkable period of time. Of course, Mel Brooks and Woody Allen, Carl Reiner, and all that crowd, they were young writers. They were terribly young and really inexperienced. So everybody was trying to achieve something in a brand new medium, which was very exciting and very dynamic and very special. Names who were prominent in radio disappeared completely because they weren't capable of dealing with their images being on screen. But from there, I was discontented at NBC. General Sarnoff called me a discontent. He was the chairman, by the way, of NBC. And a very clever guy said, if any man that's discontented at NBC is somebody that's going to come to work for me. So he hired me to run a radio station in New York, to be general manager of WINS in New York. And it was there that a wild thing happened, another episode of my life, which is rock and roll. You mind if I take a moment to tell you a little about this?
Oh no, I want to hear about this.
Well, I was looking to develop music for the black market, for black kids. And a song plugger came in and recommended a disc jockey in Akron, Ohio, who, by the name of Alan Freed. And he said, this guy is sensational. He's got all the kids, all the black kids out in Ohio, listening to this rhythm and blues music. So I went out to Ohio, listened, thought the guy was sensational, and hired him. And I put him on at midnight in New York, and we ran a dance at a wrestling arena in New York, and I sat in the box office, and everybody that arrived was white. All the kids were white. There were no black kids arrived. So my associate and myself said, well, this is incredible. The music has broken out into the white community. And it's no longer a black music. It's no longer a New Orleans rhythm and blues. It's now become a national factor, a major music factor. So we put Alan in an earlier time period, and he was the messiah of rock and roll. If anybody that knows the history of the music would know. He was a brilliant guy on air. Everything he played became a vast hit, was an enormous hit, sold 1 million records. And because my radio station, by the way, my radio station covered a vast area of the Eastern Seaboard, not just New York. Well, anyway, he was called Moondog. That was the name, his nickname was Moondog. And he, one day I got a summons, and I got an injunction from the Supreme Court in New York against using the name Moondog, because a blind beggar in New York City used to stand on 6th Avenue outside of the CBS building, sued us, and won the injunction on the basis that he was a professional musician. Now, why was he a professional musician? He played a cigar box with strings. You know, and people, rich guys, posh guys would hire him to their dinner parties, you know, just for laughs. But this made him a professional musician. And under the law, a professional can protect his name. You can't protect yours, I can't protect mine, but a professional in the entertainment business can protect his name. So under this rare verdict, I had to come up with a new name for Alan Freed's show. We sat in my office, and my program manager, Alan Freed's manager, myself, and I said, you know, I heard some lyrics that morning, New Orleans rhythm and blues lyrics. We're going to rock and roll tonight. I said, you know, it's pretty salacious, it's pretty kind of nice. I said, let's call it the Rock and Roll Party. Well, I was the boss, and everybody said, great. And so we named it the Rock and Roll Party that night, and it went on the air as the Rock and Roll Party, Alan Freed's Rock and Roll Party. Well, immediately, Variety, Billboard magazine, Variety, which was the famous publication in show business, music business, and every publication picked up the name rock and roll and made it the rock and roll era. I couldn't copyright it because it got out of hand. It really, in 3 months' time, it was like an explosion, and everyone was calling it the rock and roll era. And some of you may remember, it was a staggering era in the music industry. It was the biggest ever in the music industry. It changed the whole nature of the music industry as far as young people were concerned. So it was named. I named it rock and roll, and historians in the music business know this is a fact. But I couldn't protect it. There was no way to protect it, and I never really talked about it. And somehow or other, it's leaked out in a couple of places, and Google in one place or another. And matter of fact, Google has some documents which I signed, where I contracted with Alan Freed on air. But I never really thought about it till my kids, my two boys, said, "Dad, you got to start publicizing some of this nonsense." I said, "No, I'm leading a wonderful life. You know, I'm leading a nice, quiet, innocent life in Grassington." I said, "I don't want this all this nonsense." "Oh no, you got to do it. You got to talk about it because it's very important." So I got together with a guy to collaborate on a book, which is in the process of being finished now, which I hadn't ever wanted to do. I've left this all to Bunty. She's my celebrity in Grassington. I wanted to really lead a very quiet life here until all this happened. Now you come along and expose
We're digging it all out again, yes, because it's
which is terrible.
Because that's not the half of it, is there?
Well, it's not the half of it. I'll just briefly go on. There's so much more because after I left, I was hired. Apparently because of the success I also promoted the stage shows. Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, all of these people worked for me, and we did the first stage shows in many, many years in New York. We had 200,000 kids and 10 performances at the New York Paramount come to see Alan Freed's rock and roll show. Well, we had as many 20 acts. Bill Haley and the Comets, for example. He was a production band for us, but he was clever enough to create Rock Around the Clock, and still takes bows all over the world for creating rock and roll, which he had really nothing to do with. He was just a cheap band that I used. But the list of artists was quite fascinating. Elvis Presley, for example, was never involved with rock and roll. Never. He was a country and western performer. He basically went into the movie business, into movies, then Vegas and the adult market. He never appeared before a kid. Yet people to this day think he's one of the foundations of rock and roll. He wasn't. The period developed a whole new group of record companies, and didn't put RCA and Decca and those out of business in Columbia, but a whole new group of record companies came into existence. Jubilee, Atlantic Records. Atlantic Records, as a result of our playing their tunes, was sold for $20 million to Warner Brothers 2 years later. And to this day, the creator of Atlantic Records tells people that I made him a millionaire. I wish to hell I had owned some of the music myself, but I never did because I was operating the station. And we had, it was a wonderful but sort of a torturous year because I was condemned in the pulpit for destroying the morals of children. I was chased by district attorneys because of, they said that the live shows were inflammatory and creating drug abuse. It was an unbelievable thing. Preachers actually preaching against not only me, but the music and Alan Freed in the pulpit in major churches. And parents hated me. I would go to a dinner party and parents really said, "You're involved, you created this whole mess." You can't, maybe you do remember, but not too many people do, that it was a very provocative period of time. I was happy to get away from it. And after a year, I was offered a job running the biggest radio and television stations in New York, WOR Radio, which Bill would know, and Channel 9 in New York. And I happily left, and I never admitted to anybody I was involved with rock and roll because I went into a totally different environment. We were a major station, the radio station was the biggest, probably most important in the world. It was a delight to run. If I have any fancy as far as the mediums I've been involved in, it's radio. I always found it exciting, provocative, instantaneous, marvelous news gathering medium. And I ran this major television station in New York where I deeply got involved in sports because we carried the New York Mets baseball team, the Jets football team, the Rangers hockey team. I carried all of these on air. And so I got deeply involved with their ownership and with them and the marketing of sports. But, you know, listening to me, you'd say this is a successful guy. You've heard about a couple of my debacles, have you not?
I've heard about them.
I mean, for example, I was offered in 1961, I was offered an 8th share in the Cleveland Browns American football team by who was a guy who was my close pal and associate. He wanted $50,000 for the 8th share. He was buying the team. I turned him down because I didn't think much of a future for, there wasn't much of a future for American football in America. That eighth interest was sold for $100 million 2 years ago. I'm not exaggerating. This is on the record. $100 million. You know, if you're going to be a failure, be a big one. In the course of all of this nonsense, because of my successful record, a guy approached me to run a radio network for him, and he offered me. I didn't like the guy, and he offered me shares in a little oil exploration company in California as part of the deal to come over as president of the network. I turned him down. The shares happened to be Occidental Petroleum. Those 4,000 shares that he offered me wound up being worth $20 million. So now we're talking about $120 million. That's just the two mistakes I made. But I have no regrets. Life has been so wonderful. And I can't be, you know, I could take another show to talk about politics and.
I was going to say, I'm only a third the way down the list here.
Well,
I've got a list of politicians a mile. I've got, weren't we president of RKO Pictures for a little while?
Oh yeah, well
didn't we produce a film as well?
Well, yeah, I quit. In the middle '60s, I got kind of tired of radio and television. I've been doing it for many years, and the company owned RKO Pictures. Which was a big studio at the time. They bought it from Howard Hughes in the early '50s, and that's in itself is a very interesting, it's kind of interesting story. It was all happened out at the airport in Las Vegas. Hughes insisted the meeting be there, and the chairman of our company, Tom O'Neill, and myself, a couple others, went out to meet Hughes and his entourage. And Hughes said, all you people away. And he took my boss up in a little light aircraft flying over Vegas at night. And Tom, of course, was sick because Hughes got up from the controls at one point and said, look, I have to go to the John. He said, do you mind taking over the controls? Well, Tom had never flown a plane before in his life. And he was over the Rockies. And anyway, Hughes was a very eccentric guy, to say the least. So he came back, and on that flight, he sold RKO Pictures for $25 million to Tom O'Neill on the flight. Got out of the plane, said goodbye, and left. We never, ever saw him again. I inherited all his paperwork and all the nonsense that he left behind, and his stooges really, they closed the deal. His assistants, Johnny Myers and those guys. And we owned RKO Pictures, which we were a failure at. I had nothing to do with it. We were a failure at. And Tom O'Neill in 1959 said, I want to get out of the motion picture business. It's run by the hoodlums and the unions and whatnot. We're selling the studios in Los Angeles and Hollywood. So we sold the studios to Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. And we went out of business. We literally went out of business. We still owned the vast reservoirs of films that we had made, and we acquired in the acquisition of the company some brilliant, wonderful films. They were some of the major films of Hollywood. But in 1966, I said to O'Neill, I said, you know, I'm traveling all over Europe. By the way, I was at the World Cup in 1966 in London. And when I was there, people asked me, well, what's RKO doing? I said, well, don't you know it's been closed for 7 years? He said, oh, no. This is the power of a name. The name was so powerful, and the antenna with the exploding, you know, the electricity coming out of it was so vivid, and the pictures were still in the cinema, that everybody thought the company was still alive. I said, Tom, we got to reopen the company. And we reopened it, and he made me president of the company in 1966. And I was president of an RKO without studios, which was great, because the studios were in a decline. There was no longer the studio. Everybody was doing independent productions and co-production around the world. So I made a series of movies. When I say I did, I was president of the company. Made a series of movies in Britain. You had the Edie plan here where you subsidized it. We were partners with the British distributors. I made a number of movies in Spain, a number of movies in Italy. Matter of fact, I had an office. I was talking to Bunty and a friend the day before yesterday about our Italian restaurant in Skipton, where I'm a hero. We talked about my office in Rome, which was the glorious days, because it was the days of the spaghetti westerns, the Clint Eastwoods and the Telly Savalas's and all those guys. And we used to sit around in front of the Excelsior Hotel at night and just drink ourselves silly, and everybody was poor and trying to make a buck. And it were wonderful, 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 wonderful days. The movies then were not designed basically for the cinema. They were basically designed for television. They were action movies, and they were low-budget action movies. For example, I made a movie in Spain with Bill Shatner, who Star Trek. You probably heard of Bill Shatner. Now, Shatner was comparatively unknown in those days, but I was on a very tight budget, so I said, Bill, you're going to play twin Indians for the same price. And he played twin Indians in the movie for me. And Joe Cotton was in the movie, but Joe Cotton was almost dead by then. You know, I just put his body on screen and his name up in the lights. And what else? Oh, and Chris Mitchum, Robert Mitchum's son. I never said Chris Mitchum in the title. We said Mitchum. You know, so we did everything to hit the budgets on these movies. But the Shatner thing is funny because Shatner wrote a book a year ago. He wrote a biography in which he said the worst movie he ever made was White Comanche in 1968 for me, which he was conned into doing Twin Indians. So it's public knowledge. But it was great fun, and I left RKO in the late 60s, produced a Broadway show with Sandy Dennis, who had won an Academy Award that year, and I produced a movie of my own, which did win, was selected by the Cannes Film Festival to be shown. And it was called Revolution. It was about the Haight-Ashbury district, about the hippies, the advent of the hippies. And it was a critic selection at Cannes, not a national selection, but a critic selection. And again, there's another case where I don't know, I must have lost $2 million there, because the movie was never shown at Cannes. Because Chaplin's daughter, whatever her first, I can't remember her first name now. Geraldine Chaplin, the voice from the audience prompted me. Geraldine Chaplin got up on the stage as my movie was to be projected and waved her hands and said, "We're going out in support of the students at the Sorbonne who are are rioting. We're not, this capitalistic venture is not going on, blah, 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 blah." And all the left-wing directors and whatnot jumped up on the stage and supported her, and the festival was killed right on the spot, and my film was never shown. Well, any film shown there was worth millions to the owners because all the buyers were there, and the publicity was, is enormous. My film was never shown. And then they sent an emissary from the burning stockades at the Sorbonne down to Cannes and said, "Can we play your film behind the burning barricades?" as an insult to General de Gaulle and his wife, who they blamed as being suppressing freedom of speech in France. I said, sure. So I went to United Artists, who were the distributors. They wouldn't give me a copy of my film because they didn't want to antagonize de Gaulle. So it was never shown in Paris behind the burning barricades, which would have gotten it on the cover of Life magazine and Look magazine for sure. So then again, when I got to the States with the movie, again I was threatened with arrest. You know why? You'll be fascinated by this, Andrew. I had a nude ballet in the movie, which was part of the bohemian atmosphere of what was going on in the Haight-Ashbury district. They appeared on every college campus in America, but the district attorney in Cincinnati decided I was purveying filth. The guy in Texas, the congressman in Texas, cut the premiere date in the Texas location because of he didn't mind the nude ballet. He was concerned about the exposure of drugs, the fact that we did a documentary about the drug abuse in the Haight-Ashbury district. So I was, everywhere I went, I had to go, I was really a suspect because you can't believe this. This was only 1968, that 43 years ago, this restrictive attitude was going on in the world. But we've come a long way in the last 40 years.
You seem to have been leading a lot of youth astray in your time, haven't you?
Well, yes, I have. I have. But the film, and of course the film Revolution never did well, but it's the best archive of the Haight-Ashbury district that exists, and which I still technically own, but that's been another problem. But the 70s, I came here in 72, and my life changed completely, which delighted me no end. I was married Bunty and had a child here, and located in Grassington, which you know how I feel about Grassington. I
do, Bob.
Would you like me to express myself? Well, there was a marvelous play called Brigadoon, a musical on Broadway stage. And there was a little village called Glockamora in one of the lyrics. And the hills of Glockamora. Anyway, I wish I could carry a tune. But in Glockamora, the elves came out from under the rocks. Now, I admit John Benson is not an elf, but
more of a gnome.
Yeah, not even a gnome, let alone an elf. But I always, to me, Grassington is like Glockamora. And it's why I kind of resent any intrusion from the outside world, because I've been all over the world, as you've been, so many times. And yet I find this place the most wonderful, wonderful place to live out your life. I think it's remarkable. It's totally unique. The people are unique. The area is unique. It is my Glockamora. And I have a theory about it. We're 10 miles from all the violence in Skipton. The robbers don't like to get on one road drunk. Mm-hmm. So there's total absence of binge drinks, of robberies. This is incredible. Incredible in the world, not just in England or Britain, but in the world. Something to treasure. And I hate the intrusion of outside interests who try to destroy my walled community, so to speak. But I can't think of any place I'd rather be. And I'm an American. I lived most of my life in the States, and I've had an exciting life. But as Bunty will tell you, I want to get home. We were in the States last week. I'm always anxious to get back. And there are a lot of imponderables, but generally the people are wonderful here. And there's an absence of violence and it's a serene scene.
That's a nice thing to hear said.